A shipment of gold, $300 million in value, left Burkina Faso only to vanish at a European port. No storm, no pirates, no accident. It was seized, not by chance, but by design. The order came under pressure from Washington, and soon the voice of Donald Trump echoed, "Africa must pay its dues." In Ouagadougou, the news struck like thunder. For President Ibrahim Traoré, this was not trade, it was theft. The very wealth meant to build schools, hospitals, and fields of harvest had been chained as collateral for debts written in foreign capitals. Sovereignty itself was on trial. Yet what could have broken a nation became the spark of defiance. The humiliation of one landlocked country threatened to ignite a fire across the continent. Could Africa, long bound in contracts of dependency, turn this insult into the seed of independence? Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point that history will remember. Subscribe and walk with the story. It began with silence. Containers filled with gold, mined from the red earth of Burkina Faso, reached the gates of a European port and never moved again. There was no court order, no criminal charge, no legal dispute. Instead, there was a whisper carried across the Atlantic, a whisper that spoke with the weight of Washington. Hold the gold. Soon the whisper had a voice. Donald Trump, sharp and unapologetic, declared that if Africa wished to take part in global trade, it must first honor its debts. With those words, the gold of a small Sahel nation was transformed from a symbol of dignity into collateral on a balance sheet written in Paris and Washington. In Ouagadougou, the revelation hit like an earthquake. President Ibrahim Traoré knew this was not business. This was robbery. The wealth dug by miners with blistered hands, the treasure meant to nourish children, fund hospitals, and plant seeds of food security, had been frozen in steel containers. Sovereignty itself was not simply questioned, it was held hostage. The streets erupted. Men and women filled the squares with voices like fire. "They steal in daylight and call it law," shouted one protester, his words echoing on radio stations and WhatsApp groups. Teachers spoke of children robbed of their future. Farmers asked why debts signed by distant regimes should consume the sweat of their soil. Students painted walls with slogans, "Our gold is not your guarantee." The IMF stood at the heart of the storm. For decades, loans had come wrapped in conditions. Repayment in dollars backed by guarantees. Guarantees that meant Africa's own wealth, oil, uranium, gold, could be seized at any moment if repayment faltered. To Western officials, this was stability. To the people of Burkina Faso, it was a ransom dressed as law. Inside the presidential palace, Traoré gathered his ministers. Some urged diplomacy. Perhaps repayment schedules could be renegotiated. Perhaps compromise could free the shipment. Others, weary of generations of compromise, shook their heads. When Traoré spoke, his voice cut through the silence. "They want us to bow. They want us to pay debts we never chose, with gold mined by our blood. If we bend today, there will be nothing left tomorrow." Beyond the walls of power, miners left their pits and marched with tools held high, a living symbol of defiance. Mothers joined with bread in their hands, crying that their children's hunger could not be collateral for foreign banks. Soldiers in the barracks whispered in disbelief. If they could seize the nation's gold, what would they seize next? Western media framed it differently. Headlines spoke of instability, recklessness, and danger. Analysts in London and Paris dismissed the anger as another sign of African fragility. Yet inside Africa, the narrative shifted. Traoré's stance was not seen as rashness, but as courage. In the villages, his words traveled faster than official broadcasts. People heard in him not only the voice of a leader, but the heartbeat of a continent. And so the truth became unavoidable. What began as a single seizure at a European port was no longer about containers of metal. It was about dignity, sovereignty, and the right of a people to decide their tomorrow. The question lingered like smoke in the air. If a nation's gold could be frozen abroad, did Africa truly own anything at all? What began as a single shipment seized at a port was about to ignite a continental fire. The anger did not fade. It grew like fire carried by the wind. In Ouagadougou, the boulevards filled with protesters who chanted not in confusion, but in certainty. The gold was not lost to pirates, nor delayed by storms. It had been seized deliberately. Collateral for debts signed in rooms where no African voice had spoken. Radios repeated the words of Donald Trump until they sounded like an insult carved into stone. Africa must pay its dues. For many, this was not policy. It was humiliation. Miners marched from the goldfields, tools raised as banners of resistance. Students staged sit-ins at universities, demanding an end to IMF dependency. Mothers lifted their children on their shoulders, shouting that the future could not be mortgaged to foreign creditors. Inside the presidential palace, the weight of history pressed on every corner. Ministers debated nervously. Some urged diplomacy, a soft hand to negotiate release. We can offer repayment schedules, one suggested, eyes fixed on the floor. Others were less patient. They had seen decades of schedules and compromises, each one draining more than it returned. Silence thickened until Ibrahim Traoré rose. His voice was calm but carried steel. They want us to bow. They want us to pay debts we did not choose, with gold mined from our own blood. If we bend today, there will be nothing left to stand on tomorrow. The room fell quiet. In that silence, the realization crystallized. This was no longer about one shipment. It was about sovereignty itself. On the streets, the mood hardened. Young people painted murals of Africa's wealth bound in chains. Farmers pledged to contribute part of their harvest to support any move toward financial independence. Even in the barracks, soldiers muttered, "If they can seize our gold, what will they seize next?" Yet beyond Africa, the narrative was rewritten. On Western screens, commentators spoke of instability and recklessness. CNN called Traoré inexperienced. A London paper labeled him too young, too dangerous. Panels of analysts warned of famine, instability, even collapse. It was psychological warfare, a chorus meant to scare Africans back into obedience. But the effect was the opposite. Each insult strengthened the sense of betrayal. Each warning deepened the conviction that this was not recklessness, but defiance. And defiance was the only answer left. Then came the turning point. At a gathering of the Alliance of Sahel States, Traoré spoke openly. "They hold our gold because they know it is our strength. They call it collateral. I call it ransom. And if we accept this ransom, it will never end." The words hung heavy in the air. For a moment, the room was still. Then a minister from Mali broke the silence. "What if we stop sending gold through their ports? What if we keep it here in Africa?" Heads turned. The idea, radical only hours before, was suddenly real. Keep the gold on African soil. Build reserves beyond the reach of Brussels, Paris, or Washington. Protect wealth with African hands, not foreign vaults. On the streets outside, chants grew louder. "Our gold, our Africa." Students spread messages online. If they fear it this much, then it must be our only hope. The seed of a new idea was planted. Not just resistance, but creation. Not just anger, but vision. Western governments dismissed it as fantasy. One European official scoffed, "They do not have the infrastructure. They do not have the unity." But what they underestimated was determination. Traoré sensed the tide shifting. What began as a scandal was becoming a movement. The seizure meant to humiliate Burkina Faso was uniting the Sahel around a single truth. Africa's wealth could no longer be trusted to foreign hands. And at that moment, one radical idea surfaced. What if Africa kept its gold within Africa? The days that followed were unlike any the nation had seen in generations. The seizure of gold was supposed to cripple Burkina Faso with shame. Instead, it became the ember that set an entire people in motion. In villages, farmers gathered beneath the shade of baobab trees and pledged grain to sustain the nation should sanctions tighten. In schools, teachers reminded students that the future was worth defending, even if the price was hardship. In the markets, women lifted their voices, asking why debts written by past regimes should bind their children's tomorrow. The air carried a mixture of anger and resolve. Yet something more powerful was forming: unity. For the first time in years, divisions of class and tribe seemed to blur in the face of a common wound. The loss of gold was no longer seen as theft alone. It was proof that Africa's resources remained in foreign hands, no matter what the contract said. Inside Ouagadougou, the political ripples deepened. Parliament debated fiercely, but it was clear the government had little choice. To do nothing would be to accept humiliation. To act was to risk retaliation. Ministers understood that this was no longer a financial issue. It was existential. Traoré's stance had transformed from a question of policy to a matter of national identity. It was here that the term began to circulate in whispers. The Ibrahim Traoré coup was not simply the overthrow of a political order, but the overthrow of an economic one. For decades, power had been tied to loans, debts, and signatures inked far from African soil. Now, one leader dared to declare that the ledger itself was illegitimate. Beyond Burkina Faso, the shockwave spread. In Bamako, Malian ministers recalled shipments delayed at foreign ports. In Niamey, Nigerian officials pointed to uranium reserves held hostage to external contracts. Guinea spoke openly of bauxite revenues funneled abroad. Across the Sahel, the message echoed: If it could happen to Burkina Faso, it could happen to all. The idea of an African gold reserve, once dismissed as fantasy, began to take shape in debates and discussions. What if the nations of the Sahel pooled their resources, guarded not by European treasuries but by African soil? Economists spoke of shielding currencies from manipulation. Activists spoke of dignity restored. Students painted walls with murals of vaults rising like fortresses across the desert. But unity was not without cost. Western governments moved swiftly, freezing transactions, halting insurance, and hinting at sanctions yet to come. European banks raised invisible walls, cutting lines of credit. To some, this looked like a tightening noose. To others, it was the final confirmation that Africa could no longer trust the structures that had claimed to be partners. In the streets, the people responded with resilience. Farmers declared they would feed their own. Miners pledged their labor to a future that belonged not to Paris but to Ouagadougou. Soldiers, once cautious, began to speak more openly. If they can seize gold, they can seize anything, one officer said. Better we stand now than kneel forever. The mood shifted from despair to defiance. It was no longer a question of whether the seizure had been legal or justified. It was about survival, the survival of sovereignty itself. For Traore, the challenge was no longer convincing his people. It was channeling their fire into something lasting, something that could not be seized by ships or frozen by banks. Thus, the paradox of crisis revealed itself. The very act meant to weaken Burkina Faso was making it stronger. What the West called collateral, the people now called ransom. What was supposed to divide had united. And yet one question haunted every speech, every gathering, every march. Could Burkina Faso and its neighbors withstand the storm that would surely follow? For unity was powerful, but retaliation was certain. The West had tried to suffocate a nation, but instead they had awakened a continent. The crisis that began in a dusty port soon reached the halls of global power. In Washington, the language was blunt. Donald Trump repeated his warning: Africa must pay its dues. To him, the seizure of gold was not theft, but law. The law of contracts, the law of the IMF, the law of dollar dominance. Anything else, he declared, was chaos. In Brussels and Paris, officials defended the action as a matter of financial stability. European banks echoed the line, labeling the gold collateral for debts. Insurance companies, once invisible partners in trade, suddenly withdrew coverage from shipments linked to Burkina Faso. Even humanitarian cargo faced delays, a clear signal that resistance would come with a price. On Western television screens, the narrative hardened. Talk shows painted Ibrahim Traoré as reckless, too young, too dangerous. Newspapers called the proposal of an African gold reserve a reckless gamble that could destabilize markets. Analysts warned of famine, sanctions, and collapse. The aim was clear: to frame defiance as instability, to turn courage into a crime. But far from weakening his hand, the campaign revealed a deeper truth. Across Africa, the narrative was shifting. The seizure, meant to isolate Burkina Faso, became proof of a double standard. To the people of the Sahel, it was no longer about contracts. It was about dignity. It was about whether sovereignty could exist when wealth was stored under foreign lock and key. And in this shifting tide, new partners appeared. From Moscow to Beijing, from New Delhi to Brasilia, envoys arrived quietly in Ouagadougou. Their offers were not framed as charity but as exchange. Direct gold purchases, technology to refine and store reserves locally, markets that did not bend to Washington's pressure. For the first time, Burkina Faso looked outward and saw doors opening rather than closing. The Burkina Faso revolution was no longer confined within its borders. It had become a case study in resilience, a symbol that even the smallest of nations could tilt the balance of global discourse. Western commentators dismissed it as dangerous populism. African commentators called it something else: the first step in reclaiming a stolen tomorrow. At the United Nations, quiet debates began. Could an African reserve challenge the architecture of global finance? Could the dollar's dominance be threatened by a handful of nations in the Sahel? Diplomats chose their words carefully, but the unease was unmistakable. For decades, Africa had been told that resistance would bring only isolation. Yet the opposite was unfolding. The more the West condemned, the more allies arrived. What had begun as humiliation was transforming into a coalition. And with each passing day, the vision of an African reserve grew less like fantasy and more like inevitability. Could this reserve not only change Africa's future, but also shake the very foundation of the dollar? The struggle reached a turning point not in Africa, but in Europe. A whistleblower leaked internal memos from a major bank, confirming what many had long suspected. The seizure of Burkina Faso's gold had not been a neutral act of regulation. It had been ordered under direct pressure from Washington. The documents spoke with chilling clarity. Without control of African gold, IMF leverage would collapse. This cannot be allowed. When the revelations reached Ouagadougou, the effect was electric. What had been indignation turned into vindication. The words of Ibrahim Traoré, once dismissed as rhetoric, now stood as truth carved into paper. Law, it seemed, was not about justice, but about domination. On the streets, the response was overwhelming. Tens of thousands filled Independence Square, carrying banners that read, "Our gold is our freedom." Farmers carried baskets of grain, declaring they would sustain the nation if imports were blocked. Students waved their tools of learning as weapons of dignity. What had begun as anger was now pride. Across the Sahel, leaders who had hesitated stepped forward. Mali pledged support, Niger promised uranium reserves, Guinea offered bauxite revenues. What was once a dream whispered in closed meetings became a continental project, the African Gold Reserve. It was still fragile, still vulnerable, but its roots had sunk too deep to be erased. Western capitals scrambled, sanctions tightened, narratives sharpened, but the momentum had shifted. What was meant to bury Burkina Faso had instead planted a seed of unity across Africa. For the first time in generations, leaders spoke not of dependency, but of destiny, yet challenges loomed. Infrastructure would need to be built. Vaults reinforced, trust negotiated, markets secured. Some warned that the road ahead would be perilous, lined with sabotage and pressure. Others argued that Africa had already endured the worst, poverty, exploitation, and silence, and had nothing left to lose. In Ouagadougou, Traoré spoke plainly. They wanted to bury us with shame. Instead, they have planted a seed, and that seed is unity. If we build this vault, it will not belong to one nation. It will belong to Africa. His words carried beyond borders, becoming a call not just to governments but to people. Miners, farmers, students, soldiers. The future was uncertain, but the direction was clear. What had started as a scandal over seized gold was evolving into something far greater. A continental awakening. The question now was no longer if Africa could break free, but when. What began as humiliation at a European port had grown into something larger than gold. $300 million worth of treasure had been seized, yet what Africa gained in return was priceless. Conviction. The story of Burkina Faso was no longer about containers frozen by order. It had become the spark of a continental awakening. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré stood not only as the president of a landlocked nation, but as the voice of a generation. He declared that gold was not collateral, it was freedom. And in those words, Africans heard something deeper. A promise that sovereignty could no longer be mortgaged to debts inherited from the past. The Ibrahim Traoré coup was not merely a change of leadership. It was a rupture in the system of dependency, a bold defiance of the logic that had kept Africa kneeling for decades. From farmers who pledged grain to miners who lifted their tools as banners, the people transformed loss into strength. They proved that dignity, once awakened, could not be seized. Around the continent, momentum grew. Mali, Niger, Guinea, and others lent their voices to the vision of a common reserve, an African vault built on African soil. To Western capitals, it was dismissed as fantasy, even danger. To Africans, it was survival. The idea of an African gold reserve, once dismissed as a dream, had become a plan etched in the hearts of millions. And so the story of Burkina Faso became more than national history. It became the beginning of a Burkina Faso revolution, a symbol of what it means to resist, not with weapons alone, but with unity, conviction, and vision. The people had been shown the cost of submission, and they chose the road of dignity. Yet the journey is not over. Obstacles remain, pressure will mount, and the weight of retaliation will be heavy. But the seed has been planted, and seeds have a way of breaking even the hardest soil. If one small landlocked nation dares to stand, what stops the rest of Africa? Do not look away. This is more than a headline. Subscribe, share, and walk with the story of a continent reclaiming its tomorrow.